Picture yourself as a surgeon. You are in the middle of open-heart surgery on a 2-month-old infant at the William Soler Pediatric Hospital in Cuba. Suddenly, the room goes entirely black. The life support monitors die. The backup generator fails to start. Across the ward, doctors and nurses sprint toward the neonatal intensive care unit. With the mechanical ventilators dead, they grab manual ambu bags, pumping air by hand to keep the newborns breathing. They pull premature infants from the cooling incubators and swaddle them in thick blankets, hoping their body heat holds out until the grid comes back online. A manufactured fuel shortage has paralyzed the island's grid, starving the country of energy without the need for a storm or natural disaster. There simply isn't enough power to keep medical equipment running, or even fuel the buses that staff rely on to reach the hospital. This energy starvation is the result of a tightening economic blockade. The island has been systemically cut off from the global fuel market, a strangulation campaign that accelerated under the administration of Donald Trump, which forces you to ask, why? Cuba has no massive oil reserves to plunder, like Venezuela. It has no nuclear weapons program. It poses no immediate national security threat to the United States. There is no standard geopolitical logic for a siege this devastating. To understand this punishment, you have to rewind to the birth of the United States. Right after declaring independence in 1776, American leaders looked south and assumed Cuba would eventually become part of their new union. Sitting at the entrance to the Gulf of Mexico, it was a geographic prize they believed was destined to be theirs. History didn't cooperate. In 1898, Cuba finally broke free from Spanish colonial rule with American military assistance. Yet, instead of absorbing the island as a state, Washington turned Cuba into a subservient protectorate. They engineered this through the Platt Amendment of 1901. As a condition for American troops to leave, Cuba was forced to sign away its sovereignty. The United States granted itself the power to control Cuba's foreign policy and intervene in its domestic affairs whenever it saw fit. This legal trap allowed for a massive economic takeover. By the late 1950s, American corporations owned 90% of Cuba's mining wealth, 80% of its public utilities, and nearly half of its sugar production, extracting the island's riches without extending American citizenship to its people. The amendment also forced Cuba to hand over permanent territorial outposts for the U.S. military. That is how the American naval base at Guantanamo Bay was established, a lasting physical footprint of dominance that exists to this day. American fury toward Cuba is a century old. In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt wrote a letter stating, "I am so angry with that infernal little Cuban republic that I would like to wipe its people off the face of the earth." He was enraged because the island refused to be a quiet, compliant asset. The paradigm of forced obedience ended on January 1, 1959. The Cuban Revolution, led by Fidel Castro, ended 60 years of American control. Castro dismantled the economic engine of American extraction. He nationalized the massive corporate farms, the industrial mines, and the oil refineries, offering zero compensation to the American executives who had run them. Then came the geopolitical insult. Castro allied his government with the Soviet Union. This was a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, Washington's 2-century-old rule barring rival foreign powers from operating in the Western Hemisphere. Washington retaliated with brute force. Under President John F. Kennedy, the CIA organized a covert invasion to overthrow the regime, an operation that collapsed at the Bay of Pigs. When military force failed, the strategy shifted to economic suffocation. In 1963, U.S. Senator George McGovern wrote an article asking why the U.S. remained so fixated on the island. He pointed out that the obsession wasn't about security, it was about pride. McGovern realized America had fallen into an ego trap. A superpower finds it difficult to endure the insults and defiance of a neighbor it could technically vaporize, but politically cannot control. For over half a century, economic strangulation impoverished the Cuban people, while the regime remained in place. The rigid posture finally broke in late 2014. President Barack Obama admitted that the 50-year embargo was an obsolete failure that harmed American interests, and he initiated a diplomatic pivot. Over the next year, the two nations restored full diplomatic relations. After a 54-year freeze, embassies reopened in both capitals. In March 2016, Obama traveled to Havana, becoming the first sitting American president to visit the island since 1928. For a brief window, pragmatic statecraft replaced the obsession. Rational diplomacy managed to override a century-old imperial grudge. But that window slammed shut. Successive administrations reversed the thaw, ripping up diplomatic progress and slapping tighter sanctions onto the island's fragile economy. That return to maximum pressure is what drained the nation's fuel supply, leading directly to the grid failures paralyzing Cuban cities today. Which brings us right back to where we started, the dark hallways of the William Soler Pediatric Hospital. The pride of dead 20th century politicians still demands a price today. Doctors pay that debt as they pump air into the lungs of infants in the dark. Cuba has survived 60 years of economic blockades, but the current state of the island reflects a more extreme phase of economic warfare. Recent American policy has been defined by sudden reversals. President Obama's diplomatic opening was rolled back by the first Trump administration in 2017, followed by 4 years of baseline pressure under Joe Biden, ending only when Biden removed Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list in early 2025. But that reprieve ended in January 2026. Within weeks of his second inauguration, Donald Trump authorized a military operation to kidnap Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro from the capital of Caracas. The operation severed a vital energy link. Venezuela had been providing Cuba with 27,000 barrels of oil every day, meeting a quarter of the island's energy requirements. Following the kidnapping, the U.S. pressured Venezuelan authorities to halt all shipments. Cuba's tap turned off overnight. This wasn't a standard diplomatic dispute. By cutting this foundational artery, the administration initiated a modern geopolitical siege designed to physically suffocate the country. To close the loop, President Trump issued an executive order on January 29th. It established a national emergency, imposing steep tariffs on any country attempting to supply Cuba with oil. Physical enforcement followed. In mid-February, a U.S. Coast Guard cutter intercepted the oil tanker Ocean Mariner and forced it to divert away from Cuban waters. One Russian tanker did manage to reach the island in late March, delivering 730,000 barrels of oil. That after 3 months of total energy deprivation, this single shipment did little to stabilize the crisis. This shows the resulting collapse of the Cuban power grid. Without imported fuel, the electrical network began to fail node by node. Blackouts reached 20 hours a day, culminating in March when the entire national grid failed at once. Modern sieges do not require physical walls. By legally and physically severing energy inputs, the infrastructure of an entire nation collapses under its own weight. As the grid failed, the crisis moved into hospitals. Without reliable electricity, critical medical equipment became unusable, forcing a halt to elective and urgent care. The Cuban Health Ministry eventually reported a backlog of 96,000 delayed surgeries. As the chart shows, that total includes 11,000 pediatric cases that were suspended because of the fuel and power shortage. The fuel shortage also paralyzed the country's transport. Workers could no longer commute, and the fleet of trucks responsible for delivering clean drinking water to over 1 million people remained stationary in their lots. Systemic failure soon reached food and sanitation. Without refrigeration, storage, or fuel for agricultural transport, food supplies dwindled, while garbage began to pile up in the streets because collection trucks lacked the fuel to move. Multiple reports identify Secretary of State Marco Rubio as the primary force behind this strategy. As the most vocal critic of normalization, Rubio is the singular figure in the administration pushing the United States to prioritize the total collapse of the Cuban government. Rubio's political base in Florida includes 1.8 million people of Cuban descent, many of whom demand the fall of the current regime. For Rubio, maintaining this hardline stance serves as a crucial foundation for his own domestic political future. The paralysis of 11 million people functions as a deliberate political lever, designed to serve ambitions back on the American mainland. Despite this humanitarian disaster, the government under Miguel Díaz-Canel remains intact. The regime has proven resistant to surrender, even as the country around it grinds to a halt. In May, the Trump administration escalated the siege by imposing secondary sanctions. These measures target any foreign bank or company that deals with Cuba, effectively cutting the island off from the global financial system. Trump has even suggested a direct military show of force, proposing to park the USS Abraham Lincoln just 100 yards off the Cuban coast to intimidate the government into submission. This aggression comes as the U.S. remains bogged down in a separate conflict with Iran, an ongoing crisis that has already destabilized global energy markets and closed the Strait of Hormuz. Millions of Cuban citizens are now living through a man-made dark age, severed from the infrastructure required for 21st century survival. A total energy blockade can dismantle a society's physical capacity to function, but history shows that the systematic deprivation of a population rarely succeeds in breaking an entrenched political regime.